Thank you for his heart for you, a man after God's own heart. And we pray now, Lord, that what he has prepared would be your word, that we would hear it clearly, that we'd be transformed by it in Jesus' name. Holy Spirit, fill him. Amen.
Amen. Thanks, T. Right, good afternoon, everybody. Everyone okay? Everyone well? Good? Right, this is new for me, having the headset on, so it might take me a little while to get used to it. So my name is James. I am a member of Oak Tree. I've been coming to Oak Tree for 7-8 years now, so as time has flown. And I went to an old school friend's birthday dinner in Richmond last Saturday evening, and I was tucking into a pizza that was aptly called the Piggy, because it had every type of pork known to man. It was delicious. And my friend's girlfriend turned to me and said, what have you been doing during the day? Because they'd all been at the rugby before, and I'd met them a bit later. And this thought instantly popped into my mind. It said, James, you should lie. Don't tell them what you've been doing. It will be a bit weird. They won't understand it. And it was because I'd been preparing for this sermon last Saturday day. And I came clean. I said what I'd been doing. And like I found with most opportunities to bring Jesus into conversation, it was nowhere near as bad as I had feared. In fact, it was good. People genuinely seemed interested, or at least politely interested, and the conversation blossomed from there. And so I began to talk about this passage, my initial thoughts on it. And to be honest, I got a little bit carried away for a Saturday evening. I began to talk about how I loved the richness, this beautiful symmetry to this passage, how it summarizes in just 18 short verses the whole gospel. How I was amazed by the depth and the meaning of God's word, and how actually, when reading this passage, it's times like this, it's passages like this that are actually one of the bedrocks of my faith, because the depthness, the richness of this word can't be man-made. It has to be God-inspired. It's just not possible. And of course, this is an amazing example of that, isn't it? The writer of John's Gospel, who called himself the beloved disciple, who spent time directly with the human Jesus, sums up his entire life in these very cosmic terms. An insight that I believe could only come from thoughtful prayer with God, asking him over many years what this all meant. So today, yes, I'm a bit excited about this passage. I do love this passage, as you may have guessed, and there's loads of stuff, juicy stuff we could go into here, but I'm going to keep it simple, because that's about all I can manage, and I'm going to put it into 3 chunks today, 3 sections: roots, reasons, and his return. My 3 R's for the day. So, my roots. Well, my roots are that, fantastic, Emma, thank you. My roots are that I'm half English and half Guyanese. And many that know me well would say that I am very confused as a result. I was born and brought up in Reading by my English dad and my Guyanese mum, and Guyana's not a particularly well-known country, and it's not to be confused with Ghana in Africa. It's a country on South America's North Atlantic coast, which you can see here. Emma's done a fantastic job, thank you. The first time we've used Google Maps, I think, in a church sermon. And it's an ex-British colony, and as an ex-British colony, it is the only English-speaking country on the continent. It has a rich history of cricket. Chandra Paul was born there. And it has a rich history of calypso music as well. The Lonely Planet, no less, describes Guyana as distinctly Caribbean, with a rocking nightlife, great places to eat, and an edgy market. The interior of the country is more Amazonian, with its Amerindian communities and unparalleled wildlife viewing opportunities, tucked away quietly from the capital's hoopla. From sea turtles' nesting grounds along the north coast, which I've seen, to riding with cowboys at the ranches in the south, Guyana is well worth the mud, bumps, and sweat. So I think we can all agree it's pretty far away from the Thames Valley, right? So this mixed English and Guyanese heritage runs through my DNA. It is part of who I am. For example, I think I've always been a pretty polite guy. I always try to be a gent, but I'll let my wife be the judge of that. But a little bit like my friend's dinner, I can easily go off on one. I can get a little bit of passion overspill sometimes. I can get carried away. And sometimes I can be a little bit too direct, a little bit too blunt for my audience. And some would say that I love a good debate or argument, depending on your point of view. It wasn't until 15, when my parents sent me to Ghana for the first time, that some of these early traits that were beginning to develop in me began to make sense. Forever etched in my memory is day one of being in Guyana. And I was a bit nervous. It was all very different from England. When my cousin came over to my auntie's house, where I was staying, and my auntie flung open the door and greeted her with this warm shout of, you big fat ting, come here and give your auntie a hug, nah? And my English jaw dropped to the floor, and they hugged each other up, and they bounced, and they laughed, and it was just a very warm, loving moment, but not what I was used to. But there and then I thought, that's where some of the roots are, some of the roots where some of this passion overspill, some of this directness may come from. And of course it makes sense, it's logical, right? It's why we're interested in family trees, our heritage, traditions, stuff like that. Because knowing where we came from helps us know who we've come to be. The gospel writers knew this too. Matthew's gospel starts with a long genealogy, linking Jesus all the way back to Abraham, the father of the Jewish people. Whereas Luke goes further back to Adam, the father of everybody. However, here, John goes even further back and refers his readers back to Genesis 1, verse 1, in the very beginning of time, so we can understand his roots, so we can really understand Jesus' supremacy and why it is all about him. So verse 1, it says, "In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was with God in the beginning. Through him all things were made. Without him nothing was made that has been made." Yes, love it or hate it, even the 15th season of X Factor could not have been made without Jesus. "In him was life, and that life was the light of all mankind. The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness has not overcome it." So I wondered when thinking about this, and it could just be me, but are we sometimes guilty of thinking of Jesus as God's number two? Sat on God's right-hand side, right? Now, I'm a businessman, so forgive the analogy, but maybe sometimes we think of him not as a CEO, but maybe as a chief sales officer, pointing to God all the time. And yes, while Jesus definitely does that in his ministry, he's so much more than that too. Many of us know that Jesus is the Son of God. And if you're here today and you don't know that truth, then we'd love to speak to you after the service and love to pray with you as well. But do we recognize his presence right there at the very beginning of it all? Especially at the time of Advent, when we start to remember Jesus' birth in Bethlehem, do we actually remember that he birthed all of creation also? Verse 1 is crystal clear. Jesus isn't a bit of God that God sent down at some point in history to save us. No, Jesus is much bigger than that. He is a very co-creator of everything we have here. If we can remember, Jesus was present and part of the creation of the universe, that he was God, but was also with God as a person in and of himself, right there at the very beginning of it all, then it can help us to understand who he is and his true importance. The Word. This title for Jesus that John uses is almost found exclusively in this gospel. And you need to combine the Jewish and the Greek translation to reveal its full meaning. For Jews, the word meant the word of the Lord, as in, God says something and it happens. It therefore represented to them God's purpose, his intention, the very mind of God. Greek philosophy argued that the world wasn't random, that there were fundamental rational principles and truths which governed all things. And these principles that were behind existence, its very self, were called logos in Greek, or word. John brings together these two meanings into one being, Jesus. So we see here Jesus as the Word of God, meaning the living, breathing purpose of the Creator and the fundamental truth of the universe. The purpose of the Creator and truth of the universe. Like we sang today, there's little wonder that there is such power in his name. So, who do you say that Jesus is? It may seem like a silly point. Many of us would answer straight away, James, he's the Son of God. We know this. But do we actually really know him? John clearly thought that this was really important, and it's a question I believe we should ask ourselves regularly. After all, Jesus asked this of his own disciples in Matthew chapter 16. He says, "Who do you say I am?" If we say he is the Son of God, do we really believe and know what this means? Or do we need to challenge ourselves to find out more about him and who he really is? Philip asked Jesus in John chapter 14. He said, "Lord, show us the Father, and that will be enough for us." And you can sense Jesus' disappointment, his anguish in his answer. This is around the time of the Last Supper. He's been with these guys for 3 years. He knows his fate. He knows what's coming. And he says, "Don't you know me, Philip? Even after I have been among you such a long time, anyone who has seen me has seen the Father. How can you say, 'Show us the Father'? Don't you believe that I am in the Father and the Father is in me?" So if Jesus' disciples, after witnessing the most amazing 3 years in history, can ask that question, then let's not be embarrassed to ask ourselves this seemingly basic but most important of questions too. So, if that's who Jesus is, then what was the reason for his coming? Why did he come in the first place? Well, John answers this quite clearly, so we can become children of God. Verse 12, I'm skipping around a little bit. "Yet, to all who did receive him, to those who believed in his name, he gave the right to become children of God. Children born not of natural descent, nor of human decision, or a husband's will, but born of God." Again, most of us have heard this before, but it's such an important truth that I want to spend a couple of minutes just explaining and just diving in a little bit to what being a children of God, a child of God means. Firstly, and most importantly, it means that all of our debts are covered. Our new family accepts responsibility for us, and as sinners, we have debts that we are unable to pay. So God has assumed accountability for our debt through Jesus' sacrifice, so that we can come into God's family, into deep relationship with him, debt-free, completely forgiven. It's done. Number 2, our future blessings are assured as children of God. If you adopt a child, 2 things happen, right? One, that child becomes your charge, and the second thing is that child becomes your heir. The same thing happens to us as Christians. We become God's charge. Our well-being becomes his responsibility. Our growth becomes his concern. One of our first, if not our first responsibility as a society is to protect and teach our children. If we can't protect and teach our children, then we can't get anything right. And if that's how we feel as flawed humans, then understand the extent of our protection and guidance under Jesus. We also become God's heirs. Romans chapter 8 says, "Now, if we are children, then we are heirs, heirs of God and co-heirs of Christ. Indeed, if indeed we share in his sufferings, in order that we may also share in his glory." So no one's saying that it's plain sailing, but the glory is there also for us to share in. 1 Peter chapter 1 goes further and explains that through Jesus we will come into an inheritance that can never perish, spoil, or fade, an inheritance in heaven that's kept for you. This is good news. As I was researching this bit, I came across this wonderful illustration of a new mother who stayed with her parents for several days after the birth of her firstborn child. One afternoon, she remarked to her mother that it was surprising that the baby had dark hair because both her and her husband had fair hair. And the grandmother said, "Well, darling, your dad has black hair." To which the daughter replied, "But Mum, that doesn't matter, because I'm adopted." With an embarrassed smile, the mother said the most wonderful words that daughter had ever heard. "Oh yes, I always forget." All Christians are adopted children of God who are accepted with God with the same unconditional love that that mother had for her daughter. So, who do you say you are? Do you call yourself a child of God, or do you, like me, call yourselves lots of other things that don't even come close to being a child of God? Is there negative stuff from your past or your present that is stopping us from realizing the reality of what's on offer and what he's called us to be as his children? Are there negative experiences or distractions in your life that are preventing you from accepting this wonderful invitation, invitation that's available for us all? Jesus said in John chapter 8, "You will know the truth, and the truth will set you free." Sometimes we know the truth in our head, but we don't live it in our hearts. And so, because we don't live it in our hearts, we don't live in the full freedom that God has called us to. It was only when the prodigal son remembered where he'd come from and who his father was that he could come to his senses and go back home to his father. So I think sometimes it's the same for us. We need to remember who we are in Christ, who our new spiritual family is, in order for us to come to our senses so that we can claim being a child of God ourselves. Okay, so I've talked about Jesus' roots, why he came, the reason for his coming. So now let's think about his return. But as we're in Advent, before we do that, I just want to ask and shout out here, what is Advent all about? Anyone give me anything about Advent? You're all quiet.
It's about remembering when Jesus came as a baby, but also looking forward to when he comes again.
Wow. Gold star. That took me ages to research that. That's fantastic. So, originally, actually, there was very little connection between Advent and Christmas, believe it or not. The word Advent is derived from the Latin word adventus, meaning coming, which is a translation of a Greek word, parousia, I'll pronounce it, parousia. Scholars believe that during the 4th and 5th centuries in Spain and Gaul, Advent was a season of preparation for the baptism of new Christians at the January feast of Epiphany. And Epiphany was a celebration of God's incarnation, his baptism in the River Jordan, and his first miracle in Cana. During this season of preparation, Christians would spend 40 days in penance, prayer, and fasting to prepare for the celebration, which kind of sounds familiar to us, right? By the 6th century, however, Romans had tied Advent to the coming of Christ. But just like as Carolyn said here, the coming they had in mind was not Christ's birth in a manger, but it was rather his second coming as judge of the world. And it wasn't until the Middle Ages, actually, that the Advent season was explicitly linked to Christ's birth at Christmas. Therefore, Advent today sits between this fulfilled promise of Jesus' birth and this yet-to-be-fulfilled promise of his return, balancing remembrance and celebration on the one hand with this keen anticipation on the other. It's very much part of this now and not yet that we've been learning so much about over the last few weeks. So this made me think, do the holiday seasons, all of the celebrations, the lights, the decorations, the mince pies, the joyful carols, sometimes overpower the true intention of Advent, which is also to be a season of reflection and preparation for his return? In this reading, we learn of God sending John before Jesus to prepare for the way for his first coming. In verse 6, it says, "There was a man sent from God whose name was John. He came as a witness to testify concerning that light, so that through him all might believe. He himself was not the light. He came only as a witness to the light." You see, another part about being a child of God is that our responsibilities also change. Because an adopted child would be asked to try and live in the image of his new family, and in time would be asked and hope to reflect their values. Although it's important to say that's not a condition of the adoption in the first place. And it's the same thing for us as God's children. Through the grace and love we've been shown, we try to take some of the obligations of our new family, although our acceptance is not at all conditional on those obligations. Jesus came so that we could become children of God, accepted unconditionally into his family, and he also came to provide us with an example and a template of what that should look like once we claim that promise. And his last command, the Great Commission, was to make disciples of all men. We have been given the baton now. But are we preparing the way for his second coming? How can we be those signposts and those people that are John the Baptist like? How readily do we share the grace already given that Tim talked about last week when we looked at the parable of the talents? In verse 10, John says, "He was in the world, and though the world was made through him, the world did not recognize him. He came to that which was his own, but his own did not receive him." There are about 7 billion of us in the world today, and around 2.2 billion Christians. Therefore, although 2 billion in 2,000 years is a huge, phenomenal miracle in and of itself, it means that these words are still true for the majority of us on this planet today, as they were when John wrote them. And the honest truth, I think, is that saying Jesus is the only way to become a child of God isn't always an easy message. The gospel can be offensive. But we are called to be like John the Baptist and share and signpost it. I've said it before, and I'll say it again, I'm sure. But our actions and behaviors, for me, can be the most powerful testament that points to Jesus. It provides opportunities to share the gospel, to speak about Jesus. And sometimes it can speak deeply into those who know you and those that are around you. I remember how inspired I was when I first came to this church 7 years ago and met many of you, and how that helped me come to faith. So, who do you say you want to be? Are we a people preparing for a second coming? Do we have the sense of urgency that Christians had in the first century? Are we sharing the good news? Are we sharing the grace already given? Christmas is an amazing opportunity to do some of this. It's when many non-believers find themselves in church due to tradition or habit. So what one thing could we try this Advent to help us prepare to make the most of this opportunity? Maybe like Lent, even we could think of fasting or taking something up to remind ourselves to pray for this, to remind ourselves to ask God at the beginning of each day for an opportunity to share the good news, to remind ourselves to reflect at the end of the day for any opportunities that we took or any opportunities that we missed. What practical risk could you take to share the gospel this Advent and carry out his last command to make disciples of all nations? Okay, right, I'm near the end. And in closing, rather unusually for a Sunday sermon, I would think, I've decided to paraphrase a well-known atheist, Terry Pratchett. But don't worry, it's okay. If you do not know where you come from, then you don't know who you are. And if you don't know who you are, then you won't know who you're called to be. And if you don't know who you're called to be, then you're probably missing out. John the Baptist understood his roots, his calling, and he had to in order to fulfill his amazing, wonderful role. In the same way, unless we understand our spiritual heritage, Jesus' roots, the reason for him coming, and our role in the preparation for his return, then we can't fulfill our own calling for his kingdom. So that's it from me, but we'd love to talk and pray for you if any of this resonated with you. If you're not sure who Jesus is or of his identity in all of creation, or maybe there's stuff, negative thoughts or distractions that are getting in the way of you knowing you're a forgiven, loved child and heir of God. Or if you want to think a little bit more about how you can use this Advent season, not only to look back and celebrate Jesus' birth, but also how you can use it to help fulfill your own calling in his preparation for his return. Okay, thank you.